said.
No, and I think my husband was leaving 5 seconds after I got home because he called me last night and said flood watch for our cottage.
Oh, where's your cottage?
It's east of Peterborough, just
Okay.
off the 7 on the way to Ottawa.
Okay. Fourth area. I love that area.
It's a little on the edge, so it's not typical Kawartha's landscape. It's a little flatter.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a flood watch on Marmora. Yeah, just right on the Highway 7. But we're on, so it's Crow Lake. We're on the Crow River that comes out of Crow Lake. So it's the river that goes down through the town. Yeah. So it's running at double its normal flow. Yeah, and so Jerry was calling everybody we know up there. You know, can you go check our electrician, the plumber, the contractor, the conservation areas and conservation guys, and it's very. Anyway, so hopefully, we don't have a basement though, so it can
Are you on
fill
high
up.
ground or fairly
No.
high? No.
No, but the basement can fill up, like the under part can be underwater, and that's okay for us. We'll have to do some adjustment afterwards with the pillars and beams, and that's the reason we did not put in a basement is because it's on a slope and it's constantly shifting.
Really?
And the cottage conducts cold down, so yeah, it's very. The house mover was explaining all this stuff to us. He said, "Don't do it; it'll crack." The first year we put it in, so you need something more flexible, right? That you can adjust every spring. But I don't want it to get so high that like it's actually very nice inside and new carpet and stuff, and I'm just like, anyway. You're all around? Okay, great. Yeah. Sit down, I'm okay. He totally threw me for a loop.
Yeah.
So he threw David to the Wilson Center. He's like,
Did you see the old
he threw David. Did you see David?
I know.
when they started
death stare.
speaking, to start the presentation, he was awake talking on his phone like crazy.
What do you do?
Anyway, the two of you, there's a woman here that
Wants to meet Dustin and Tim the first 2 weeks of dissertation work on the Murray Darling. So I told him.
Oh, there you go.
Good. That's great.
Those are the guys.
Yeah, that's what I said. So
They're sitting right here.
yeah. At George Mason. She's at George Mason.
The Murray Darling is so much fun to do because they take it's such a bigger issue in Australia, like water
It's
policy.
like a top 5 policy issue.
It's not this weird little niche issue like it is here.
A niche issue.
Like
The largest freshwater basin in the world. It's niche.
I get made fun of all the time for being the water guy, right?
Yeah.
But in Australia,
really?
oh, totally.
But you're like a rock star in Australia.
I'm like doing a mainstream issue in Australia, and so I'm like, I strut into my interviews. I'm like, I'm doing something important here.
Well, I have to tell you, from the perspective of somebody who did climate change for 10 years, nobody was interested in what I did on climate change. The moment I started doing Great Lakes issues, people are interested. Seriously, people in the community, policymakers, it's like suddenly, like climate change, they're like evil words. Nobody wants to talk about it.
Okay, so
Yeah, I set the agenda. I took it right off the agenda, apparently.
On my introduction, I'm going to introduce you all. Can you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Just because it's a long list to go off. Yeah, it's better if you just say.
Do I have to use my real name?
Yes. No, just say I'm very darling expert.
I am Max Power.
Rock star. On location. Yeah.
Wait 2 more minutes. And I'm gonna-
Okay, pull 'em in.
We'll just cross it
The
out.
card's gonna give me away.
Yeah, I think they know.
Okay. To be fast. Try to be fast. Yeah.
Wilson Center, I'm kind of still chatting it up, so I'll let him finish.
Who's that? Oh, he'll chat forever though.
I was wondering when he posed his question if he came to see walk in the woods.
I know because we answered it.
I know they didn't. Good job.
Yeah, so he must have.
Hey, Deb? Deb?
Okay, so it wasn't. Oh yeah.
You could tilt that screen just
I
straight.
sure
I can
will.
read it, so
I
tilt it.
sure will, because after we present, we're gonna pull it. We're gonna move it right to you guys. Okay? So then you can see, because it's so awkward being behind.
As long as I can see it from the corner of my eye, that should be ideal.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to my job, so I'll do that.
Okay.
My life is crazy until the end of June. I have so many deadlines.
Mine's crazy till the end of May.
Yeah. And then July will be like,
So you realize that you're going to be setting deadlines for July and then August.
Yeah, you know, you're absolutely right. Well, it's that I'm going to miss the May and June deadlines, and I'll
Right,
still
and
be
then
doing,
it'll be- that's
like,
what
the
you'll
book
be doing.
manuscript will be like, it's not ready yet.
I'm going to blame my late authors.
Do it. Do it. Give them
That would be me.
our phony emails.
Oh, no, it's the authors, it's not me. Meanwhile,
He never showed. He said he had a mid-morning flight, so maybe he just left. Yeah. He said his flight was before noon today. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything wrong. He might have just decided not to come today.
do you want a Scooby-Dooby here?
Then we can just maybe swing that, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're ready. No, I don't really need this.
No, okay.
Okay, we're ready to regroup, and it's my pleasure to introduce the second half of our team from the Great Lakes Policy Research Network. And rather than introduce the panel name by name, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves as they speak. And but it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Deb Benayan from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. So Deb.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We want to change gears a little bit here. And what we want to do is present some research results from another quite different Great Lakes Policy Research Network project, one which really focuses on assessing transboundary adaptive governance capacity in the Great Lakes region. Okay? Now, this project really stems from a more generalized concern, which certainly is shared by the network, that there seem to be a number of environmental challenges that are intractable, despite the multitude of institutions and processes we have in place that are supposedly designed to encourage collaboration across the boundary in terms of actually addressing these environmental challenges. Now, certainly that's not to say there haven't been successes, because there certainly have been, okay? Chemical loadings is one example there. However, there are quite variable outcomes across issues. If you think about the water quantity side as opposed to the water quality side, we've had a harder time getting traction on the different factors affecting quality. And we've got some problems that are coming back, Lake Erie and eutrophication, phosphorus issues. We've got some newer issues that we are just starting to get a handle on, like invasive species, and of course the climate change issue is the specter that looms over everything and is really going to force us to think hard about how we collectively address transboundary governance in the basin. So clearly, we need a better understanding of the conditions which actually promote adaptive governance capacity in the basin. And when I'm talking about governance, what I'm talking about is our ability to collectively set goals and then implement them, right? And this is really complex in the Great Lakes because we have multiple levels of governments. So we've got our binational regime with national governments, we've got subnational states, provinces, we've got local governments, not to mention our tribes and native bands on the Canadian side. And we have a context which is very dynamic. So political, economic, and social conditions are changing rapidly in the basin. So what we're really looking to do is to find a way to measure our capacity to govern in a transboundary context, to respond to these changing conditions. And what we want is a model that we can actually, that will help us understand what's happening in a governance sense, a model that we can apply across different issues, different environmental problems in the basin, that we can apply over time, and that we can use to compare the Great Lakes with other water basins in other parts of the world, okay? So where do we look for guidance? There's a lot of literature out there on water governance, okay? A number of international organizations have done work on this. The OECD is doing multi-level water governance work. The Asian Water Governance Index is another example. There's a lot of practitioner work. Of course, we have accumulated knowledge from those that are actually engaged in basin work here. And then there's a large scholarly literature. So what we've done is we've tried to do our best to look at both the applied practitioner literatures, but also the scholarly literatures. Oh, yeah. So methodologically, all right, how did we approach the task? And what we tried to do is to seek out attributes of transboundary governance capacity. That is, what are the major conditions that we would like to see in place in order to see optimal levels of transboundary governance capacity? Now, we have formulated a matrix of 5 attributes, and an attribute here is a property or characteristic that actually describes TGC for short, okay? And we've identified 5 attributes. The first is a strong institutional basis. The second is high levels of leadership. The third is shared discourse and mutual understanding. The fourth is necessary and sufficient membership. And the fifth is the all-important sustainable resources. Now, these may seem like very general in nature, but what we're in the process of doing is, for each of these attributes, distilling very specific and measurable indicators which will give us a much better idea of the state of the attribute that we're studying, okay? And one of the arguments, the critical arguments that we make, okay, is that we need to pay special attention to the first attribute, strong institutional basis. And that is because institutions play a very special role in terms of shaping the way that we talk about issues, shaping the knowledge we have about issues, shaping the way in which actors can interact with one another. Institutions provide opportunities or constraints, okay, in form of leadership, resources, okay? So it really channels and structures what we do. And in fact, oh, I keep forgetting I can use this. In fact, you can think about it as a vessel. You know, my colleagues like to call it the martini glass, right? Here's the vessel, the institutional vessel, which shapes and contains the other 4 attributes, okay? So we want to pay particular attention to the institutional basis, but please note that we are in the process of working on the other attributes as well, okay? So I also want to make a quick note that what we're looking at is not only institutions as rules of the game, right? So the things that tell us what we may or may not do, that shape our behavior, but also networks, which are relational. So networks of fisheries managers, networks of scientists around the basin, okay? We're looking at both. Now, what are our indicators? What would a strong institutional basis actually look like? We have 4 indicators that we've been working on. The first is the degree of compliance. So to what degree, or what is the range of the possible in a transboundary sense in terms of making our actors comply with what we want them to do, okay? And here what we do is look at what we have in the basin, the types of institutions and networks, and we place those on a spectrum ranging from, you know, the tough enforcement measures through courts, you know, the third-party adjudication stuff, through a reporting and accountability regime, through thinking about, you know, you've got a widely held consensus on what we should be doing, to purely self-enforcing, self-compliance regimes, okay? The second indicator is functional intensity. And this is where we're actually trying to get at how intense is collaboration around the basin. Are we merely sharing information, or are we also consulting each other, or are we even coordinating what we're doing with shared goals, or are we actually harmonizing our policy regimes in such a way that not only do we have shared goals, we actually are coordinating our implementation, or do we have fully integrated policy regimes? The third indicator is stability and resilience. This is important. To what degree can our institutions and networks endure over time? Longevity, okay, despite changing political and economic conditions. And to what degree do they learn? In other words, are we learning from our mistakes? Are we looking around and saying, okay, well, that's not going very well. We need to change what we're doing. And then something that we've had a little trouble coming to terms with is thinking about points of interaction or linkage among different institutions. So are the ones working on water quality, are they actively engaging with invasive species? Because, you know, they're absolutely connected, right? To what degree are the different things going on around the basin actually mutually reinforcing? And fourth is legitimacy, which is really critical. Okay, to what degree do we think these institutions are appropriate and just, you know, such that we want them to succeed, we want to support them. And this has legal, constitutional aspects, political, democratic accountability aspects, but also process aspects. To what degree are institutions inclusive? Do they engage the public? And to what degree then are they seen as legitimate? Okay? So what we've done is apply these 4 indicators across 4 case studies: fisheries management, aquatic invasive species, irrigation or water takings, the Nearshore Framework. And what we have 2 of our case study authors here today. I'm going to turn the screen over to them. And I am also the author of the aquatic invasive species case, so I'm going to be integrating some of those comments in. But what we're going to do is we're going to hear from 2 of our case study authors, and then I'm going to come back quickly and provide some comparative insights across the Great Lakes Basin case studies. But then we're going to have some insights that compare the Great Lakes to other water basins in North America and abroad. And we're going to compare the Great Lakes case as a governance model to an international case, and that is Arctic governance. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Tim here.
Thank you, Deb. My name is Tim Heinmiller, and I'm from the Department of Political Science at Brock University. For those of you who don't know, Brock University is in St. Catharines, Ontario, right in the heart of the beautiful Niagara region, known for, obviously, Niagara Falls and also for our wonderful wineries. I'm making the hard sell on the Niagara region today. I'm not sure why. But in the Niagara region, a fair degree of our agriculture, in particular the wineries, are irrigated. Irrigation is not typically regarded as a pressing issue in the Great Lakes. Irrigation and irrigation water takings are more of an issue in Western North America, in Canada, places like Alberta, and in most of the Western states. There are very large irrigation projects. In the Great Lakes Basin, irrigation, depending on the year, is the second or third biggest consumptive use of water in the basin. And I think that catches a lot of people by surprise. And essentially what I'm doing in my case study is I'm looking at irrigation water takings as a periodic and prospective problem of water governance. And here's some data from the Great Lakes Commission that kind of sets up the problem that I've been looking at. On the graph, the red line represents the basin runoff in the Great Lakes Basin in July and August. And I picked those 2 months because they are the months where farmers are most likely to irrigate. And the blue line represents the total amount of irrigation in the Great Lakes Basin. And what you notice from the graph is a few things. One is that there seems to be, and this is kind of a tentative conclusion because it's only 12 years of data, there seems to be a modest trend toward increasing irrigation. And it seems to be most evident if you look at years with comparable runoff. There seems to be more irrigation now than there was in previous years when basin runoff was comparable. And you also notice kind of an inverse relationship between runoff and irrigation in the sense that in dry years, farmers irrigate more, which makes a lot of sense. Because in the Great Lakes Basin, irrigation is used as kind of a supplement to rain-fed agriculture. Rain-fed agriculture is still by far dominant, and irrigation is only used in water-short years when extra water is needed. But what it means is that irrigation in the basin creates kind of a double whammy for the streams and the groundwater sources that are drawn upon, because precisely when the streams are lowest in dry years, that's when demand for water is highest from irrigation. So it can create a lot of problems for rivers and streams and groundwater sources, particularly in dry years. It's not shown on this graph, but I would also note that the 2 largest irrigating jurisdictions in the Great Lakes Basin are Michigan and Ontario. And of those 2, Michigan is by far the largest. It has well over half of the irrigation in the basin. So in looking at the transboundary governance capacity related to irrigation, I started with an examination of three kind of transboundary institutions. And I started with the Boundary Waters Treaty. It seemed like a logical place to start. But when it comes to irrigation, the Boundary Waters Treaty provides next to no transboundary governance capacity for a couple of reasons. One is that the Boundary Waters Treaty applies only to boundary waters, so those waters in which the international border directly runs, which means that it's largely confined to 4 of the Great Lakes, excluding Lake Michigan, and their connecting waters. But those waters don't really serve as sources of irrigation water. As far as I could tell, there were no irrigation projects that actually dropped a pipeline or a pump into one of the Great Lakes and took water directly from the lakes. They actually take it mostly from groundwater sources and small streams rather than the lakes themselves. So the Boundary Waters Treaty didn't really apply in that sense. The other reason why it doesn't provide much capacity is simply because when it comes to water quantity, the Boundary Waters Treaty only has real effect when a diversion on one side of the border affects water levels on the other side of the border, and there is no single irrigation project that is so big that it would take so much water that it would affect water levels on the other side of the border. So the Boundary Waters Treaty really didn't create much transboundary governance capacity, and it related to irrigation, and it wasn't really created for that. The other transboundary institution was the Great Lakes Charter, created in 1985, and it was created specifically for diversions and water takings that would be used for irrigation. It was created amongst the Great Lakes states and provinces to govern large consumptive uses. So irrigation was one of the inspirations for the charter, but it was also kind of the death of the charter, because the only time it really came into effect was in 1992 when Michigan proposed to create the Mud Creek Irrigation District. And under the charter, it had to notify the other states and provinces that it wanted to do this large consumptive use of water, which it did. About 3 or 4 of the other states and provinces objected to the water taking. Michigan said thank you very much, and then they proceeded to approve the irrigation district and basically ignored the objections of the other jurisdictions. So the Great Lakes Charter, that was pretty much the end of it. In a functional sense, it was pretty much the end of it. And it actually was one of the factors that led to the third transboundary institution, which was the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Sustainable Waters Resources Agreement in 2005 between the Great Lakes states and the provinces. And then there's a companion compact, which has only the Great Lakes states. And it became a real operable compact in 2008 once it had been ratified by all of the legislatures in the Great Lakes states and at the federal level. And this transboundary institution actually provides an impressive level of transboundary governance capacity in 3 ways. One, it's a fairly complex agreement, so I'm going to speak about it in kind of broad strokes. One of the main features is that it established a requirement that every Great Lakes state and province create a regulatory threshold for water withdrawals. Basically what that means is that it committed every government to establishing a threshold for water withdrawals, and if the withdrawal was above that threshold, then it had to be regulated and basically licensed or permitted by the jurisdiction. And in making the licensing or permitting decisions, the agreement also included a decision-making standard to kind of harmonize how the governments would go about approving or not approving these large water takings. And there is also a section in the agreement and the compact that restricts interbasin diversions of water and lays out exactly when interbasin diversions might be permitted. But it was one of the main features of the agreement, but it's not particularly relevant to irrigation, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. In terms of compliance capacity and compliance mechanisms, on the US side of the basin, there's an impressive level of compliance capacity, in the sense that the compact is enforceable through the courts. So you have an instance here, a somewhat rare instance, of a transboundary institution with third-party enforcement, third-party adjudication. And I think in some senses that was a direct or indirect result of the failure of the Great Lakes Charter, where there wasn't this third-party adjudication. In the agreement, which is basically identical to the compact but includes Ontario and obviously crosses into Canada, you can't really have third-party adjudication because of the presence of the international border, but the agreement itself is monitored by two regional intergovernmental organizations, the Great Lakes Council and another one called the Regional Body. In terms of functional intensity, the category in which this institution fits is harmonization, which does provide a fairly impressive degree of functional intensity. I'm not suggesting that the water taking laws and policies and regulations of the Great Lakes jurisdictions are identical. They're not. There's still quite a bit of divergence in the policies, but they are all harmonized around the principles of the compact and the agreement. So they are, you could argue, harmonized in the sense that they are functionally equivalent in that sense. So there is a fair degree of functional intensity, more than I expected. You could also argue that the compact and the agreement serves as a policy floor beneath which none of the Great Lakes states or provinces fall. So it provides for a policy floor above which some states and provinces actually go, in the sense that they regulate more than they're required to by the policy floor. When it came to evaluating stability and resilience, the whole compact and agreement architecture is not even quite a decade old yet. So it's pretty early to try to make evaluations related to stability and resilience. But I do see some hopeful signs, in the sense that the two intergovernmental organizations, the council and the regional body, they do a pretty good job, it seems, in facilitating information sharing and policy learning. And some evidence of this was their involvement as kind of the hub for the development of a water resources inventory for the first time. It was an inventory of the water resources in the basin and how those resources are used. And that was a key factor itself in a cumulative impact assessment that was completed by the intergovernmental organizations in 2013. In terms of legitimacy, the compact and the agreement both have a high level of legitimacy among the governments that created them. There was a very long period of negotiation up to the formation of the agreement, and particularly the compact had to be ratified in every state legislature. It had to be ratified at the federal level, which meant it had to go through many, many, many veto points. And the chances of it actually getting through those veto points were pretty slim, and it did. It actually achieved that. So amongst the governments, I think it's pretty safe to say it has a pretty high level of legitimacy. But its level of legitimacy amongst on-the-ground water users, such as irrigators, is unclear. This was an intergovernmental initiative, and it's unclear to me to what extent irrigators and other water users and stakeholders feel a sense of ownership, so to speak, in the institutions. So in terms of final observations, overall, I would argue that there is a considerable level of transboundary governance capacity when it comes to governing irrigation, water takings in the Great Lakes Basin. And I was actually surprised by this. I didn't expect to find this level of governance capacity, given the fact that irrigation is not a huge issue in the Great Lakes, and when it does pop up on the policy agenda, it seems to be more localized and less publicized than other issues. Marcia. That one to go forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Marcia Valiente, and I am a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor, which is not known for its beauty, unlike the Niagara region. So I apologize, but there are really good wineries in Essex County.
Not as good as Niagara.
Anyway, the focus of my case study is on something that's called the Nearshore Framework. And the Nearshore is, it's unlike the other case studies because it's emerging as a kind of umbrella for linking a number of issues. And it's what I call a new lens through, and it's only been adopted in the last couple of years as a way of trying to move forward with creating a new governance framework to link a number of issues together. And the motivation for it is to make governance around those different issues more effective by not necessarily thinking about them in isolation, but trying to think of them as more of a set of issues that have interrelationships that we've kind of ignored in the past, the way that we have governed in the past. So it's one that looks forward. And so how do you actually look at a case study that it doesn't exist yet? So what I did was to look at the issue of how nutrient pollution had been dealt with in the transboundary context as kind of a way of trying to assess some of the capacity that might actually be there that will then be able to feed into the Nearshore Framework issue. Because one of the big issues in the Nearshore kind of umbrella of concerns is the issue of nutrient pollution and particularly phosphorus loading. And what I looked at in particular was Lake Erie. Okay. So in terms of, I'm just going to talk very generally, so if you have questions about any of the specifics, we can talk about it later. But in terms of the institutions, Tim talked about some particular transboundary institutions, but where my case study fits, and I think where the other case studies fits, is under the umbrella of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was first signed by the two countries in 1972. And nutrients was the major issue that was of concern at that time. Okay, so that was kind of the focus of the original Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And over time it changed because in the 1978 agreement there were new targets that were added, or it was refined in 1978 to change the targets. But the original agreement set common targets that the two countries agreed on with respect to nutrient loadings. And they both agreed on the common objectives and then agreed to go home and implement those through domestic measures. So that's kind of, and that's really typical of the transboundary governance approach that's taken in the Great Lakes through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, is there's agreement at sort of a transboundary level around policy and programs, and then the actual implementation is carried out at the domestic level through whatever particular mechanisms you can find, and they're different in the two countries just because of the differences in the political structure of each country. So with respect to nutrients, the institutions at the transboundary level are very well developed. There's a lot of, because of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement institutions, the IJC, and all of the boards within the IJC. And then at the state and provincial levels and at the national levels in both countries. There's sort of infrastructure around the nutrient issue, and there are rules that were developed at the transboundary level. There are rules at the national and subnational levels. But that's really on the development of the policy and the programs, and we'll come back to the issue of implementation, because the way Deb set it up was that what we're looking at is we're looking at the development of policy and programs, but also their implementation. Are they actually being implemented, and what's the effectiveness of them? The other thing I should mention is that we were looking at institutions, which are the more kind of formal rules and around particular issues, but also the networks. And I think with respect to the nutrient issue, there's clearly a rich group of networks at the scientific level, at the NGO level, around this issue. So people are studying the issue, they're monitoring, they're working around it, they're talking about it, they're interacting, both formal kinds of networks through the structure. What I particularly talk about in my paper is the Lake Erie LAMP. So that's kind of a formalized institution, but it links into a lot of informal networks and that. And so there's a lot of interaction around that. So you have both, and they're very well developed on the nutrient issue. In terms of compliance, I divided, I was looking at, okay, so now let's come to how is this actually implemented and what are the mechanisms for ensuring compliance with the transboundary targets. And it does, there's no kind of, unlike Tim's thing, there's no kind of transboundary enforcement mechanism. It just doesn't exist. So enforcement mechanisms or compliance has to happen at the domestic level. And on the nutrient issue, the way that it's been dealt with is through a combination of what I call carrots and sticks. I'm not the first person to use that. But that's the way I was trying to think of it, was that there's some aspects of the nutrient issue that are highly regulated. For example, effluent from wastewater treatment plants, stormwater management in both Canada and the United States are regulated, and so you would expect a high degree of enforcement capacity around those kinds of regulations. However, the rest of it, the other kinds of sources, are the decisions that are made on individual pieces of land. So landowners, municipal governments, have a very important role to play in implementing the transboundary goals and objectives. And the way that that is achieved is not through regulation, but it's through financial incentives, or there's a range of incentives, most of which are financial. So for example, in order to encourage farmers to adopt better practices in terms of how they deal with their property in terms of runoff, fertilizer, how do they use fertilizer and all those things. There's really a financial incentive that's given both in Canada and in Ontario and in U.S. states. There's a whole range of, for municipalities as well, grant programs to try and encourage, but that's really what it does, is it tries to encourage better behavior, the adoption of what are called best management practices, both with respect to stormwater and also with respect to agricultural practices. Okay, so you have these two kinds of compliance mechanisms that are out there. And I guess the point about the financial incentives is that you volunteer to participate. You're not forced to participate like you would be if you were a wastewater treatment plant and had to, report every year. In terms of intensity, certainly and Deb will talk about our spectrum, and you'll sort of see where this falls. But what we all tried to do was to say, well, what's the strongest level of intensity and the strongest, how does this fall within the spectrum on compliance and intensity and all of these things. And I think here certainly with respect to the policy and program development level, there's a high degree of coordination, if not harmonization. Okay, so there's a lot of agreement at that level. When you get down to again, the implementation, there's a lot of fragmentation. So if you look at sort of the vertical coordination between the highest level, where everyone agrees, and on the ground, it's very fragmented. There is not coordination. And at the municipal level, there's certainly no coordination horizontally either. There is at higher levels, but not really on the ground. So that's what, I mean, and the whole purpose of this case study is to sort of identify some gaps that should be paid attention to when we actually come to design a nearshore framework. And this is really the biggest gap, is the lack of linkage between higher levels and what's actually happening on the ground. I guess that's enough on that. In terms of stability and resilience, because you're linked into the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement institutions, which includes the IJC family, as they like to call it, and the national governments and the state governments, there's obviously a lot of stability in those institutions. They've been, they're involved in this issue for a very long period of time. And I guess they're not going anywhere. In terms of resilience, it's interesting because one of the actual design features of the IJC is to keep looking at issues in a new way. So like the Science Advisory Board has, as part of its mandate, to look at emerging issues. Okay, so there's always a view towards what is happening in the waters, what's sort of the water quality issue. So it's this whole system under the agreement is very science driven, but it's also sort of a continually reassessing where we are and what do we need to do. So in that sense, I would say that it's quite resilient, because the nutrient issue in particular was an enormous issue. Remember, Lake Erie was dying in 1960s and 1970s. The 72 agreement was specifically addressed towards nutrients. There was a lot of effort that went to that. The monitoring showed that phosphorus levels in particular went way down. And then they kind of stabilized for a while and then started going up, or this more sophisticated testing. But monitoring kept going, and then as the monitoring was showing these problems, and then algal blooms a couple of years ago in Lake Erie have really dramatically pushed this issue up again on the agenda. So it's not something that ever kind of totally went away, because people kept paying attention to it. So in that sense, I'd say it's the institutions around it were quite resilient, because they could respond as the actual evidence on the ground changed. In terms of legitimacy, certainly the governments and in the sense of legal legitimacy, the IJC and the institutions and the governments at the state and federal levels obviously have a high level of legal legitimacy around these issues. Process issues, if you look at Lake Erie in particular, and the LAMP and the way that the LAMP has developed, it's very open to participation from everybody. The nutrient strategy that was developed was very, there was a lot of participation from a lot of different groups as well as governments in the development of the nutrient strategy on Lake Erie. All of those things are very open. And then even within the sort of volunteer financial incentive mechanisms at the domestic level, there's a high degree of accountability, because it's public money, and so there are a lot of accountability mechanisms built into that. You can't get money unless you meet certain criteria. There's public reporting. All of those kind of accountability mechanisms are built into the implementation structure as well. Okay, so I guess the only observations that I would have at this stage, and Deb is going to kind of weave all of these things together, is first of all this idea about the disconnect between the policy level and the kind of implementation level. Because the nature of this problem, it's a very decentralized problem, because the decisions that matter, the cumulative effect of each of the decisions that every farmer in Ohio makes about fertilizer has an impact on Lake Erie. And so how do you get at that in terms of governance structure? It's very difficult. And we have never been willing on other non-point source problems to actually regulate them very heavily. We have a very light touch in terms of regulating individual landowners in terms of the choices that they make. And there are ways of getting at it, for example, through municipal land use planning regimes. There are lots of ways of getting at it. But in terms of nutrients, we haven't done that yet. And that's something that we need to, for the Nearshore Framework that we're in the process of developing, that's the piece that really needs the most attention in my mind. And I guess that would be and I just, so if you're adding, I mean, the Nearshore governance issue, nutrients is only one piece of it. You have a lot of other pieces that are going to be under this umbrella, and that makes a lot of sense because you want to make sure that those linkages are recognized in your governance framework, which they aren't now. But in order to do that, it just adds to the complexity of your challenge and makes it, you know, you have to be sort of include a lot more people and have a, you know, sort of a broader strategy, I think, for actually achieving that. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so what I'll do is just provide a few observations across the 4 cases. Again, so that was the irrigation water takings, the Nearshore Framework that Marcia was talking about, invasive species from me and one of our colleagues that couldn't come today, Mark Gaydon, who's doing fisheries. Okay, so a few ideas about looking across cases in the Great Lakes Basin, and then we're going to go out of the basin. Now, one interesting thing is that the balance between formal institutions, rules, and then these networks, relations among people, it really differs across cases. Okay, so whereas fisheries and irrigation is quite institutionalized, you've got a lot of networks active on invasive species and also in the case of the Nearshore Framework. But it's really interesting because this balance also differs across scales of governance. So the higher up you get, the more formally institutionalized things are. The lower down you get, the more networked in many ways. But there's a clear trend toward formalization over time. And what seems to happen is that there's this symbiotic relationship between institutions and networks. So you have networks of people talking, building consensus about what we should be doing, setting the agenda, you know, and sort of transmitting that to the formal treaty framework and agreement framework that we have in the Great Lakes Basin. Those are taken up into goals, you know, implementation plans. And then the process sort of starts away because the networks say, you know, whether they're NGOs or scientists or you know, Great Lakes fisheries managers or something, you know, they say, okay, well, we've done that. Let's go on to the next one. Now, my main point about that is a very important process going on across the cases. But if you look at what's happening right now, if you're going to hit budget cuts, where are you going to hit them? You're going to hit them, people, you're going to pull people back into their core departmental responsibilities. And NGOs are losing some funding and scientists are losing some funding. And so what you're doing is undermining the basis or the core that really drives a lot of the discussion about the issues we need to talk about and builds a consensus on where we need to go with that. If we look at our spectrum and compliance mechanisms, we're not fooling around in the basin. We're not just saying, you know, it would be really nice if you all did this. Our mechanisms tend to be towards the harder end. Okay, there are some differences across Canada and the US, but we tend to use a lot, of course, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. As soon as something comes under the reporting regime, as the Nearshore Framework will, that's why it's sort of above with a question mark, then you've got a whole system of accountability mechanisms that will come into play, and those are publicly visible. In terms of functional intensity, again, we're not just sharing information or consulting, we're coordinating under similar objectives, and we are actually harmonizing our policy regimes. Okay, we're not integrating yet, although some aspects of fisheries management and some of the other things we're doing actually gets close to integration. Legitimacy. The treaty framework, the harder institutional framework in the basin, I would say across the cases, provides a high degree of legitimacy and a legal constitutional sense, and then you have the democratic accountability regimes in the actual governments, right, in terms of implementation, as Marcia points out in her case. What differs, though, is the process legitimacy. So what you see is that the cases differ in terms of the degree to which they incorporate different communities and actors and the means for doing so. So the degree to which they are inclusive. So whereas the irrigation case is, you know, you've got your binational bodies, the governments and the agencies, they're making the decisions, and the irrigators are somewhere out there not really knowing what's going on. The fisheries case is actually more inclusive, and our colleagues shows that you've got the research communities and the stakeholders actually much more engaged in the policymaking regime. Nearshore Framework is actually a case that shows much more inclusiveness, where you've got local stakeholders, communities, a much broader range of the research community and interest groups involved, okay? So whereas the other forms of legitimacy don't differ that much, process legitimacy differs, and that matters. And I'm just going to give you, in a minute, I'll get back to that. But I want to leave you with two main messages about the Great Lakes cases. One is that the binational architecture we already have in place provides a critical foundation, right? It's very useful. It explains the high intensity, I think, of interactions, our ability to use harder compliance mechanisms, the high levels of legitimacy, or relatively high levels of legitimacy across the issues certainly that we looked at, and stability and resilience of the regime. And the framework we have is very useful because it can bring new issues in, like you saw that with invasive species. It can reach out and bring it up under Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. You know, we're good at doing that. But process values the degree to which negotiations are seen as legitimate, fair, right? Inclusiveness of the process, the degree to which the process is science-driven, they tend to drive success in the cases. And I would say that those require sustained attention that we're not giving right now. Okay, so if we have to think of gaps, again, as we go forward, we need to think more about process values. The second thing is that, as Marcia pointed out as well, vertical linkages across the scales are incomplete. So you've got the national talking now quite well to the states and provinces, I mean in a relative sense, okay, across our cases. The local level is often not incorporated into the architecture, or not in ways that would fulfill our requirement for actually getting coordination in terms of implementing things on the ground. At the same time, the horizontal linkages across the issues is variable. So fisheries, for example, under the convention and under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there's lots of scope to coordinate what you're doing with fisheries, with some of the water quality, habitat stuff not being done. Nearshore Framework, Marcia says there's a lot of things we need to be doing across the nutrient management and all of the other things that we're doing, but that's where it's taking place, and that discussion is taking place at lower levels. The animus for actually starting to integrate horizontally is taking place at the lower levels. It's a bottom-up type of process, but remember what I said about the vertical linkages not reaching down. So we've got a binational framework that's stable and resilient, uses hard compliance, but not doing a good job of linking to where we probably have would have the most success in terms of coordinating across issues in the Great Lakes. Local authorities play a really key role here. Okay, so let's move then out of the Great Lakes Basin and do some cross-basin comparisons here.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Carolyn, for this opportunity to join the discussion today. My name is Dustin Garrick, and I'm a professor of water policy at the McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, which, to follow the geographic theme, is situated right on the banks of Lake Ontario. And I am new to the region and fortunate to be working with colleagues who have a lot of expertise in the Great Lakes, Gail Kransberg and Savitri Jetu, who are with us today. And I'm going to be talking about the potential to learn from comparison in water quality governance in transboundary waters. Now, I mentioned that I'm new to the region. Most of my research has been focused on transboundary river management in semi-arid river systems of the Western North America region and also Southeast Australia, which are two regions with conflicts and competition over water allocation, adaptation to climate change and extremes, and issues with environmental flows. They're also considered to be at the leading edge of the global water crisis. And the proposition is that there may be potential to learn some lessons from the experiences in those regions that are relevant for the Great Lakes and vice versa. And this fits into growing recognition of a global water crisis internationally, which takes different forms locally. And the quote that's shown on the screen here notes that the 21st century is going to be an era of increasing circulation of ideas, expertise, and talking about networks, exchange of models of water governance. And what we need to do is to bring our science, to bring our policy engagement to a place where we're making explicit, rigorous comparisons that can determine what is the scope for mutual learning across different settings. And specifically, what I want to talk about today is what we can learn from transboundary rivers with shared challenges in different contexts, and talking specifically about the issue of non-point source pollution, which affects 4 river systems, which are shown on your screen here, rivers and lake systems. The Great Lakes, US-Canada border, the Columbia River Basin, which is also shared between the US and Canada, and then 2 semi-arid rivers, the Colorado River of the southwest US and northern Mexico, and the Murray-Darling Basin, all confront issues of non-point source pollution, although the drivers are different. And non-point source pollution is really an ideal topic to compare because the sources are diffuse, they really connect to land use practices, and therefore it implies a watershed-based approach, which needs to be coordinated at different scales, including at the transboundary river level. And I just want to note briefly in terms of the drivers of non-point source pollution, that you have diverse sources in the Great Lakes. We just heard about the Nearshore Governance Framework. In the semi-arid regions, the non-point source pollution is connected to salinity and irrigation practices, which affect the salt content of the rivers and affect the viability of different water uses downstream. So I'm going to use the NIAT framework and the indicators really to reflect on a series of lessons, broadly speaking, across these 4 basins. And the first one, relating to formal institutions and relational networks, is this idea that I like to describe as Goldilocks governance. The challenge of building capacity at different levels and coordinating them. And this first lesson is that there's a need to move beyond the dichotomy, the contrast between a top-down or a bottom-up approach to building capacity at all levels, and then building the linkages, as we've heard in the previous discussions, to coordinate them across scales. In the Great Lakes, there's a Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but uneven local capacity to improve water quality. In the Columbia Basin, shared between the US and Canada in the West, it's the Columbia Basin Treaty, which exists as the formal institution at the transboundary level, is silent on water quality. It focuses on hydropower and flood control principally. But water quality has been addressed locally quite effectively, and also subnational scale through the Total Maximum Daily Loads, the TMDL program on the US side of the basin. And it's been particularly addressed through the wider efforts to recover salmon fisheries in the Columbia Basin, which has provided issue linkages to build capacity for addressing these non-point source pollution challenges. So what you see is a situation in the Great Lakes with a clear top-down approach, which has been complemented by the development of local institutions. In the Columbia, you have a bottom-up approach, which lacks this overarching approach. And this shows that neither top-down nor bottom-up are going to be sufficient. Both are necessary, but not sufficient. Whereas in both the Colorado River Basin and in the Murray-Darling River Basin, you have capacity at all levels. You have a basin-wide agreement on salinity, and you have a commitment, as you see in the logo here in the Murray-Darling case, as a partnership between 6 governments that are working together and also in partnership with the community. So this is an example of Goldilocks governance, getting past the top-down versus bottom-up to building capacity at all levels and coming up with the right mechanisms to coordinate them. The second big lesson relates to compliance, where in this preliminary findings from this comparison, there appears to be an inverse relationship between the scope of the governance regime and the level of compliance, which is to say that in situations like the Colorado River Basin and the Murray-Darling, they have a governance regime around non-point source water quality that is narrowly focused on one main source, salinity. And compliance is high. And what you see in the chart in the Colorado River are a series of compliance points in the river system. And what has happened since this regime has been established in the late in the 1970s is that Compliance has been consistent throughout the basin, despite even a period of unprecedented low flow starting in the late 1990s. So narrow scope, high compliance. Whereas in the Columbia River Basin, you have a situation where you have the diverse sources of non-point source pollution, and restricted principally to bottom-up or subnational level regimes for addressing it. But there has been some effectiveness in addressing water quality because of the potential for issue linkages with the salmon fisheries. And this is an example that may be relevant for the Great Lakes, is to try to harness the transboundary governance capacity that exists in other areas in order to address the more complex and intractable problems associated with non-point source pollution. The final lesson that I wanted to highlight relates to functional intensity and the linkages between functional intensity, or the degree of integration that's been achieved in these transboundary governance regimes, and the legitimacy, stability, and resilience of these regimes. So the main point that I wanted to take away from this is that integration, this highest level of functional intensity, cannot come at the expense of the information gathering, the consultation, the process values that we've been hearing so much about. So I should mention a word about the picture that you see on your screen, which is taken from the Murray-Darling Basin in the October of 2010, when the Basin Authority, which a federal authority had been created under new legislation in 2007, was developing a comprehensive basin plan. This is addressing water quantity, water quality, environmental flows in a system-wide fashion. Okay, so it complements and will be building on a variety of agreements on issues such as salinity and water quantity that have been addressed earlier. And in the process of developing this plan, the local community was not consulted extensively in the lead up to the first phase of releasing the plan. And you see, when the plan was released, there were controversial proposals to reduce water diversion levels in the Murray-Darling, and you had a major backlash, political backlash from irrigation communities that would have been affected, and the same irrigation communities that were considered partners and were integral to the salinity agreement that had been considered so successful. So the main point is that as we achieve integration, as we achieve that functional intensity, not to forget the process values and the lower levels of intensity that need to be in place to sustain a legitimate transboundary governance regime and ensure its resilience over time. And so finally, in terms of this brief sweep of the lessons from other global examples, I just want to emphasize some of the main observations. The first, again, around Goldilocks governance, needed to build capacity at all levels, both local and transboundary, and to coordinate it. And second is that what you see in the contrast between the Great Lakes and Columbia on the one hand, and the Murray-Darling and the Colorado on the other hand, is that not all types of pollution are created equal, and that the types of pollution are going to dictate the appropriate governance regimes to manage them. The higher the diversity of sources, apparently the lower the compliance. And so that's going to be necessary to find strategies for building transboundary governance capacity in those settings. And we see from the Columbia Basin example, where you have hundreds of millions of dollars a year spent on salmon recovery, that they've been able to harness the capacity in salmon recovery efforts in order to improve water quality and address non-point source pollution. This may be a relevant implication or finding for the Great Lakes. And then there's also the potential to specialize functionally, to come up with more narrowly focused capacity in specific issues, specific types of non-point source pollution, in order to build the capacity in those areas. And then finally, within the Great Lakes, to continue the process that's been attempted in the policy network here, to learn from local successes and failures, to treat these as experiments that may then be adapted to other local communities throughout the regions. And then finally, I want to end with the main point, which is that for generations, that the eyes of the world have been on the Great Lakes as an example, a model. It's informed efforts in the European Union and its Water Framework Directive. And in turn, the Great Lakes has looked abroad for lessons. And I think that exchange is going to be increasingly critical with the complex challenges that we're dealing with today. So I'd encourage the continuation of the process of engaging in 21st century policy exchange in a globalizing world, and for us to work on rigorous methods so that we can systematically learn from the experiments that are happening. And I want to thank you all again. And I, at this stage, would turn over to Kate to learn from the Arctic.
Do you mind pushing that down? Okay, can you see?
Yeah, I think so. Good morning, everyone. Catherine Friedman from the University at Buffalo, Research Associate Professor of Law and Policy. In the critical, or hailing from Buffalo, a critical actor in the beautiful binational Buffalo-Niagara region. So,
You sure did.
there you go. Okay, so yes, I am talking to you this morning about Arctic governance, clarifying that I am not an Arctic governance or an Arctic expert by any stretch of the imagination, but as Deb mentioned earlier, one of the purposes of our team was to really come up with attributes of transboundary governance capacity and apply these attributes and apply this framework in different settings. And what a more, compelling case study than the Arctic region. I think it's an extremely relevant and timely case study for our work. A couple of things to note before I start. And again, there are some very interesting parallels or similarities to the Great Lakes region. It is experiencing a profound transformation driven by climate change and global economic forces. And in addition, there's a conversation going on among the key stakeholders in the Arctic region about governance. And the question for them is, are existing governance arrangements adequate? I think these 2 points sound very familiar to those of us who have been engaged in Great Lakes governance work, but there are also a couple of other similarities. I have not been able to find a universally agreed upon definition of the Arctic, or boundaries for the Arctic, right? There are a number of different folks out there who describe the Arctic in terms of maritime boundaries, physical boundaries, geopolitical boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. Again, very similar, I think, to the Great Lakes region, where different people describe, well, it's the Great Lakes region, it's the Great Lakes basin. Some folks just focus on the 5 lakes, others focus on the St. Lawrence River. So that also is a very interesting similarity. And also very interesting, this was actually great for me in terms of learning about an area of the world that I really wasn't familiar with. There are more and more variety of interests in the Arctic that are not in the region. Much has been written recently on Asia's interest in the Arctic, with Japan and China and South Korea applying to the Arctic Council to become permanent observers. And again, sort of an analogous situation. You can imagine, and again, this is more so, I think, in the economic context, but you see it in the water context as well. Folks outside of the immediate region having an interest in what is going on here. So again, I think from an economics point of view, you have all, states like Tennessee and Georgia in the south that are integrally linked via supply chains to the Great Lakes region, particularly the automobile industry. But then you also have, I think, water interests, right? Water diversion interests, the Southwest, for example. So again, another analogy to the Great Lakes. Something interesting that I found, another reason why I think the Arctic was important and relevant to our work, it has emerged, according to some, as a governance barometer, in the sense that it is an area generating early indications of the growing need for innovations in governance. And this is something that I've been pushing our team on, and something that I will come back to at the end. Very important, I think, for those of you who are interested in policy. I'm thinking about governance innovation. Okay, so very, very quickly, because I think we are running just a tad bit late. Like the Great Lakes region, many formal institutions and informal networks in the region. You have global institutions, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. You have the International Labor Organization Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. You also have regional institutions and networks. You have the Arctic Council and the ICC. You have sub-regional bilateral agreements, such as the Norwegian-Russian fisheries regime. You have functional, did I do functional? Yep, there we go. Functional arrangements, the International Maritime Organization. You also have NGOs, the International Council for Science. And you have networks, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Network, which is a network of primarily scientists, but it is about facilitating partnerships on observation and data management. Okay? In terms of compliance mechanisms, mostly you have soft law. You really don't see a lot of harmonization and integration when it comes to compliance. You have a lot of nation states that prefer not to settle disputes under international agreements. And where there are sector-specific regulations in areas such as transport, in areas such as tourism, oil and gas exploration, there's a strong sense that where regulations exist, that they are currently inadequate. Okay? In terms of functional intensity, well, again, sort of related to the compliance, primarily cooperative. You see a lot of consensus building and information sharing. Primarily, the main arena for collaboration to take place really is in the Arctic Council. It is comprised of the eight states, and indigenous people have permanent observer status, but there isn't a lot going on in terms of the harmonization and stronger integration of actions and regulations and laws taking place in the Arctic. It's still very much concerned with building consensus and sharing information. In my view, the governance regime in the Arctic is fairly stable and fairly resistant. The Arctic Council, which I mentioned, had evolved from the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, which was this formalized strategy adopted by nation states back in 1991. The Arctic Council was established in 1996. And indigenous peoples, again, were brought on as permanent observers. So it is resilient. It is responding to demands and changes that are taking place out there in the world. And it's also, it's resilient in terms, again, of the need for stronger regulations, as I suggested. So the Polar Code, for example, is proposed. It's on the table right now, but it would cover a full range of issues regarding the design, construction, and operation of and environmental protection matters regarding ships operating in the Arctic, but then also the Antarctic, okay? So, are these institutions and networks considered legitimate? The regime as a whole is much younger than the Great Lakes governance regime that is in place. Is again really only started to get a little bit of uptake in the 1990s. But even so, over the last 20 or 25 years, there's a sense that in terms of legitimacy, it's so-so. The legal mechanisms aren't real strong. Politically, you have eight nation states that are sort of dominating the discourse. Others are trying to get into the game. In terms of process legitimacy, I think it's fairly weak. There's a real sense that the indigenous voices need to be taken into account as well as other non-state actors. Again, very similar to what you hear in terms of process legitimacy in the Great Lakes region, this need to engage local actors and NGOs. Local in this context is indigenous, right? But, different scales, but very, very similar problems. So simply in terms of my observations, again, I think it's been a really interesting case study in terms of looking at transboundary governance attributes. There are similar challenges, similar opportunities, but for me, I think one of the key themes, and to echo something that Dustin said, not only should we continue to engage in rigorous comparative analysis to inform some of these broader water governance conversations that are taking place, because this clearly is a global issue. I'm sort of a global girl, right? I'm sort of trained, to think more internationally. So it's really interesting. I come at these issues from up here, and I work with folks, who are like in the trenches in terms of local government activity down here, and there does need to be, I think, a better connection between the two. But I think that it would be really, really great to have a conversation begin between Great Lakes governance stakeholders and experts and Arctic governance stakeholders and experts, because I think that it's a place to start, and there's a lot that could be learned from each other, and who knows what kind of policy innovation or governance innovation could take place. To me, I found it striking that these scholars on the Arctic are talking about that region as the laboratory for governance innovation, and in my humble view, I submit that perhaps the Great Lakes might actually be the laboratory for governance innovation, and putting both at the table might spawn some new ideas that could, at the end, result in better policy outcomes in both areas. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are at the point where we will take some questions for the comparative panel who's presented with a lot of different information about transboundary governance capacity. Are there any questions from the floor?
Everybody's stunned.
Hi, thank you all for your insights and whatnot. A question, you mentioned that most of the institutions moved from an informal status to a formal status over time. Did you find that that trend also correlated with the resiliency of those institutions in your projects?